Hello, I am proud to welcome you to the Spring 2022 Leadership Lecture Series. My name is Dr. Leanne Bartolini. I'm a professor of psychology at Dominican University and a member of Dominican's Institute for Leadership Studies Board. Dominican University of California and Book Passage, the San Francisco Bay Area's prized independent bookstore, have partnered for many years to co-host this leadership lecture series. Together, we have welcomed 143 world-class leading authors who engage our campus with our community in socially relevant discussions and highlight inspiring acts of leadership across the disciplines. A special thank you to Elaine and Bill Petrocelli for the amazing Book Passage bookstores in Marin and San Francisco that have contributed so much to our Bay Area community over the last 45 years. Tonight's lecture sponsor is Bank of Marin. For more than 30 years, Bank of Marin has been a leading business and community bank in Northern California. Today, Bank of Marin operates in 10 counties with 31 branches across the Bay Area, Greater Sacramento, and Amador counties. As an integral part of the philanthropic landscape, Bank of Marin invests in many nonprofit organizations, not only through banking and lending services, but also with financial contributions, donating at least 1% of annual pre-tax profit back to their nonprofit community and employee volunteerism. Since opening their doors in 1990, the bank and its employees have donated millions of dollars, served on hundreds of nonprofit boards and committees, volunteered thousands of hours to local philanthropic endeavors. We thank you, Bank of Marin. Our distinguished speaker tonight is Dorothy Wickenden. She is the author of Nothing Daunted and has been the executive editor of The New Yorker since 1996. She also writes for the magazine and is the moderator of its weekly podcast, The Political Scene. A former Nieman Fellow at Harvard, Wickenden was National Affairs Editor at Newsweek, and before that was a longtime executive editor at The New Republic. Tonight, Dorothy will discuss her book, The Agitators, Three Friends Who Fought for Abolition and Women's Rights. She will be in conversation with Elaine Petrocelli, president and co-founder of Book Passage. Please join me in welcoming Dorothy Wickenden and Elaine Petrocelli.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bartolini. And thank you also for the work you do at Dominican with women's rights and women's psychology and all that it requires. This is a book that is a perfect fit with your important work. I am so proud to be able to welcome you all to this event. Dorothy Wickenden spoke for us soon after the pandemic started on a Zoom event when it was brand new. And she was so terrific that I really wanted to have the paperback. I think about this book a lot because I would have missed it had a friend named Nancy not called me and said, go get your New Yorker. There's the most amazing thing in there about the three women. And she started talking, and that was, I said, stop, I've got to read this article. And then I had to read this book. So Dorothy, thank you so much. It's such an important book. And I think my first question to you is something that I'm still curious about. How did someone find this story? A lot of us have studied history. Nobody told us about these three women who were friends who did so much to stop slavery and to bring on women's rights.
Yeah, that's for sure. When we were, going in high school and even in college, at least I can speak for myself, you didn't learn much about women's history. There were no women's studies courses. It just didn't exist yet. So this was a totally serendipitous thing. I was actually working on my previous book, Nothing Daunted, about my grandmother who had grown up a couple of generations after these three amazing women. And I had never been to Auburn, New York. And she had said in her oral history, which my mother recorded, that her grandparents lived next door to Lincoln's Secretary of State, William Seward. So I thought that was kind of cool if it was true, but I wasn't sure it was. And I went up to Auburn. I went straight to the Seward House Museum and asked the director, and he said yes. And then the young education director, a young woman, took me in hand and she said, let me give you a tour of this house. And she did not want to talk about William Seward. She wanted to talk about his wife, who nobody had ever heard of, except for the very few people in and around the Seward House Museum. She took me downstairs into the original basement kitchen, where she told me Francis Seward spent a decade harboring fugitive slaves. And then she said, historians, mostly male historians, just never pay any attention to Frances. And it's outrageous. They think she was an invalid because she was partly an invalid. She had migraine headaches and so on. And she said, there's this great untold story about her. I've been reading her letters and they're just remarkable. So I was completely captivated by that. And then she said, and her best friend, Martha Coffin Wright, who was a, firecracker of a Quaker and shared her radical beliefs, lived around the corner. And they got to know each other very well, and they started conspiring and just between the two of them. And then Harriet Tubman joined their little cabal. So we talked about that, but I was finishing my other book, and then I kind of put it back in the back of my mind, or I tried to, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. And she had told me that Tubman spent the last 48 years of her life in Auburn, New York. And I thought there is something about the relationship among these three women that is so compelling. And I just began to dig into the archives a little bit, and the more I dug, the more I found, and I just took it from there.
What a journey, and how lucky we are. How did the two women meet Harriet Tubman?
So this was kind of a young girls network, an old girls network, however you want to describe it. The Harriet Tubman, I knew very little about her when I started the book. I think most of us knew that she was this great American hero, the Underground Railroad conductor, and so on. But that's where my knowledge effectively stopped. And I never really thought that she didn't do these incredible rescue missions on the Eastern Shore all alone. Of course not. She was part of this network. And a key part of the network was a group of women. There were all kinds of people. There were enslaved people, there were Black men and women, there were ship, owners, all kinds of women. But one of the key elements of this was women, Black and white, and it had to be a very trusted network. So Harriet Tubman liberated herself from slavery in 1849, walked to Philadelphia because she had heard it was a free city where there were abolitionists who were conspiring to overturn slavery. And she found her way immediately into this very tiny, tight-knit group of abolitionists, which included Martha Coffin Wright's much older sister, Lucretia Mott. And so she got to know Lucretia. Harriet Tubman had, among other things, had this incredible talent of figuring out whom she could trust and who really could help her. She was a great strategist. And she and Lucretia Mott immediately became friends. And then clearly it was Lucretia Mott who introduced Harriet to Martha when Martha went down to Philadelphia on one of her annual family visits. And then Harriet Tubman needed contacts across the North as she began these missions. And the Auburn is right in the center of New York State. So the first thing Martha would have done was introduce her to Frances Seward, because Martha and Frances both had these basement kitchens where they harbored slaves. And so Auburn became one of Harriet Tubman's regular stops. She got to know those two extremely well. They became two of her trusted friends. And that was, the heart of this story.
It's amazing. Harriet escaped, and one of the things in your book that maybe I should have known, but I didn't, is how she escaped in the first time singing right in front of the master, and then she couldn't write. Could you talk a little bit about how she did it?
Yes, she was, it's so hard to describe in just a few words how multi-talented this woman was. And again, this is one of the thrills of writing this book. And when you think about what she had to overcome in order to do what she did, and not to mention the later chapters of her life, but just to get to your question. So she was enslaved, and she was on the plantation, staying with her near where her mother and father lived. She was 27 years old. She had just heard she was going to be sold to the Deep South. She didn't have time to tell her mother that she was going to be leaving, but everything was done in code among enslaved people. And so she sang this song in which she said, I will be going, but do not worry, I will be back. In effect, that was what she sang. And this became one of Harriet Tubman's favorite stories when she began to tell the story of her life in the North. She loved pointing out how stupid the slaveholders were. They thought, of course, that Black people were not intelligent. They prevented them from reading and writing. So they assumed that what harm could they come to? They were terrified, presumably, of the people who enslaved them. So Harriet Tubman was not. And she had spent her entire youth, her parents were active on the Underground Railroad locally. She had spent her entire youth absorbing all of this information about how it worked. And she somehow created this map in her mind about what were the different escape routes. She figured it all out. She had it all planned because she knew from a very early age that she would have to leave. She had thought that her free husband would come with her and two of her brothers. They wouldn't go. They said it was too dangerous. They would be caught and killed or torn up by bloodhounds. So she went by herself. She walked alone for almost 100 miles to Philadelphia. And that's where she quickly, insinuated herself into the Underground Railroad network there. And then, gradually expanded her contacts in Boston and across New York.
But I would think that most people who got out of slavery through the Underground Railroad didn't go back, but Harriet kept going back. Other people.
Yes, she did. And this was something that her new abolitionist friends in Philadelphia, they told her, absolutely do not go. It's impossible. It was so dangerous. But she was deeply religious. And this is one of the things that actually she and Lucretia Mott had in common. Quakers, believe they have the inner light, and they believe that God speaks through them, and it's their moral obligation to act upon their beliefs. Harriet Tubman literally believed that God protected her and spoke to her and kept her safe. So she manifested no fear. She may have felt it, but she never manifested it. And the people who did agree to come out of slavery with her trusted her absolutely. And she was very strict on these missions. She said, I will shoot anyone who says that he will not go along. You must listen to me, you must follow my directions, and I will get you there safely. And then late in life, as she lived a very long life into the 20th century, and she was speaking in Rochester, invited by Susan B. Anthony, who had become a friend. And she boasted, I can say what most conductors on real trains can never say, that I have never lost a passenger. And she never did, as far as we know.
Amazing. And then, so there was Frances Seward, married to a rising politician. She wasn't suited for the life of a politician's wife, I don't think. But here she is hiding slaves in the kitchen. How did she pull that off?
She was allowed, well, so she lived in Auburn. Her husband became, he was elected senator from New York in 1850. And she said, I am not going to go to Washington. It's a town where slavery is legal. I hate politics. I will not go with you. I'll come down. I mean, basically, he agreed to that, but told her she had to come down once a year for a couple of months, which was the high entertainment season. So that was the deal they struck. Very unusual marriage. And he, when she was in Washington, he wouldn't allow her to breathe a word about her political beliefs, about the rights of women, or about abolition. It was that, I mean, this was a very Southern society. However, when she was in Auburn and she lived in her father's house, and which she inherited, and that was where Seward lived when he came back to visit her, he allowed her to do pretty much what she wanted. And again, remember, women were their husband's property by law. He was much more liberal-minded, much more than most men. And he thought it was kind of great, actually, that she engaged in this kind of activism, and that she went totally under the radar because she was Mrs. William Seward, and she was sickly, and she was so quiet and genteel, and she would never do anything remotely illegal. So nobody, and again, women were held in such low esteem that and he thought this was really quite wonderful. So one time he came home and Frances happened to be away, and he wrote to her, oh, well, the Underground Railroad works wonderfully. We had 3 passengers here last night. So he thought he was a very liberal, what we would say today, liberal politician, and he quietly encouraged her activism. He thought it would help her health, among other things.
It would. Could you talk a little bit about Seward being in Washington and during the period of the Fugitive Slave Act, and how that worked out with in New York? Because actually, when I read your book, I had forgotten that things were not so wonderful in New York, and some really awful things were happening.
Yeah, you may have forgotten. I didn't know most of it, and I just found it completely fascinating. And so one of the things so the Fugitive Slave Act was passed in 1850, which meant that Southerners could basically invade northern free states, find whatever Black person they wanted, say this was a slave of mine and I'm going to take him back. And there was just a very, very brief procedural thing that would take place. And just, hundreds and hundreds of people suddenly were being sent back into slavery. Some of them had never been enslaved at all. Seward in Washington, of course, knew some of this was happening, and he spoke out against it very strenuously. But it was Frances who was his private correspondent and private advisor, and so she kept him very well informed about just how outraged his constituents were, even conservative constituents, about the Fugitive Slave Act, because these were their own states, and they didn't want these Southerners coming in and making what they thought were their own laws, were Southern laws, and this was suddenly a national law, and they hated it. And so there were uprisings, and when these slave catchers came in, there were these these cities had little mobilized units, and they would ring all the church bells in the city, and all of these radicals would rally, and they would have these rescue operations where they'd take away the fugitive slaves and often just take them all the way up to Canada. And they were quite successful in Syracuse and Troy. Harriet Tubman helped the slave rescue in Troy. Just astonishing history.
I'm glad you mentioned Canada, because I was very interested in the fact that, first of all, Harriet went back and got members of her family, not her husband. And then when things got bad, they had to take them to Canada. I found that so fascinating that here we are, thinking of the Vietnam War, how people went to Canada. It's it's just so illuminating, but it wasn't particularly wonderful for her parents, I gather, in Canada.
No, it wasn't. Tubman said when the Fugitive Slave Act was passed, she told a friend in Canada, I wouldn't trust Uncle Sam with my people any longer. And so Canada was then a province of England. But it was very far north. It was freezing cold. Her father wasn't well. Her mother got very cantankerous in her old age, and she had taken these elderly people from the only place they had ever lived, and both of them by that point were freed, but they had gotten involved. They were implicated, and they actually had been involved in helping a group of fugitive slaves get out. So the law was, and Harriet had heard this, and so the authorities were moving in on her, especially on her father, and she decided, well, I have to go down and get them. So she did. They didn't particularly want to move. So there she took, but they depended on her totally. So she moved them to Canada. She stayed in Canada when she was there, which was not nearly often enough as far as they were concerned. So over the years, over the 1850s, as Frances got to know Harriet, both these women were very, very deeply tied to their families. And Frances felt guilty. Here she was, this aristocratic woman. She felt she wasn't doing enough. She wanted to do more than harbor fugitive slaves in her basement kitchen. So she suddenly got this idea that her father had died. She had inherited all of this land in Auburn from him. She and her husband, Seward, had already been selling these plots of land to Black families as a way to help them make their way up in the world, and eventually for these Black men to vote, because Black men could vote in New York if they had $250 worth of property. So she got this idea to sell a plot of land, which was 7 acres and a house and some outbuildings, a barn, to Harriet Tubman, a fugitive slave. So this is a white woman selling this property to a fugitive slave. It's just about as illegal and daring as you, especially for a woman like Frances Seward. I mean, by that point, she had completely transformed herself from this very conventional, very spoiled and pampered, upper class white woman into a revolutionary.
Maybe making good trouble, right?
Yes, exactly.
But she wanted to give that house to Harriet, but Harriet wouldn't let her. I found that fascinating.
Well, that was a bit of speculation on my part. I don't have a record to show that. So I had to parts of the book, it is totally based on fact, but because I wanted it to tell it as much through the perspective of the 3 protagonists as I could. And I felt I knew these women after living with them for years. And it made total sense to me that Frances would have done that for Harriet Tubman. She didn't need all of this money. She desperately wanted to help this friend of hers. But Harriet, she also knew, and this is documented elsewhere, did not take charity. She was incredibly proud. So she would take donations for her trips to the South to rescue her people, but she would never take an outright, gift. So she clearly, they negotiated a reasonable price for the house, but it was the terms were very generous, and she was allowed to pay it off over many, many years. And the loan was finally forgiven much later. So,
well, since this event is sponsored by my bank, Bank of Marin, I have to feel that the bank that wrote that mortgage, those bankers must have been really way ahead of their time.
Well, and interestingly enough, Frances's and Henry Seward's son was the one who wrote up the terms of the mortgage. He was just starting his own bank in Auburn. So there you go, family affair.
So Seward, as we know, was very ambitious. He thought he was going to be president. It seemed like everybody thought that they were way more qualified than Abraham Lincoln. But it must have been really hard on the marriage when all of that was going on.
Well, the whole marriage was troubled. It really, almost from the beginning, because Frances was 19 when she got married. He was 24. He was a young lawyer. She thought he would be basically like her father, that he would be a local lawyer. Perhaps he'd become a judge someday. He'd be there every night. He'd help her with the children. They'd work in the garden. And he told her within weeks after they got married, he said, I loathe litigation. I despise it. Politics is the most important business in the country, and that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to become a politician. And her heart sank. She just hated it. She thought it was a very grubby business, and of course it was very corrupt, at least as corrupt as it is today, possibly more. And but he was absolutely right. He was a gifted politician. She could see that. She fought against it. She kept trying to get him to change his mind. And then she just finally gave up. And that was in the 1850s when she decided, okay, well, I'll make the best of it. And I'll try to push him as far as I can toward, some of the ideals that I believe in. So she was a total abolitionist. He wasn't willing to go nearly as far and as quickly as she was. It took him a long time to get there because he was a politician.
Yeah, it reminded me of the civil rights era and Kennedy being visited by the Black leaders and not being ready to make that next jump.
Yes. And what Seward thought, I mean, Seward's a fascinating figure too. I kept getting tempted to go, do more on him too. So Francis was constantly lobbying him, as were Frederick Douglass and then a whole little group of abolitionists in Boston. And so he was constantly getting peppered with these letters from these men saying, Mr. Seward, you are the great leader of the Republican Party. It is your obligation, to come out and do more than you are. And he would write back and say, I can't. You are the ones who go out and talk in the pulpit and in the street. And once you bring enough people around, and there's a majority of people who believe in what you and I believe in, then I can begin to write legislation.
I think Roosevelt once told, I don't know whether it was Eleanor or someone else, that the people had to make him do something. I can't remember what it was,
yes.
But
yeah, exactly.
I can see that. But I've been thinking about Martha Coffin Wright. Here she is, a mother of 6 kids, no reason to be involved in this movement other than a real belief in what was right.
Yes, and she too, each of these women was radicalized in her own way. And for Martha, she was basically a born rebel. She was a Quaker. Her mother, her family line went all the way back to the founders of Nantucket, the Quaker founders. And one of her early ancestors was one of the first ministers on Nantucket. They were very anti-slavery. Her older sister, Lucretia Mott, was a Quaker minister. So these were her role models. Her father died when she was young. Her mother ran her own business, brought up her own children. So Martha just thought, well, of course women are men's equal. Well, and so she just thought that these laws were preposterous, and she hated being stuck at home with her 6 children. She loved her children, but she found being a housewife utterly exhausting. It took she was up before dawn till, well after her husband was in bed. And she argued with him all the time. She thought that women in 1840, she was arguing that women who work should make comparable pay. And they got in this huge argument. She wrote all about this to her sister Lucretia. And when they finally had enough money to help to hire a seamstress to help her with her sewing, and she said this woman, Miss Soule, should make exactly what David, her husband David's outdoor man who helped him with his chores, did. And he said, well, that's preposterous. That would just, cause an uproar in the community. And she wrote all about this. And he went off to hoe his corn or cut asparagus. And so I thought, this was 1840. It wasn't until 1963 that Congress passed the Equal Pay Act. And of course, even now, women don't make what men are making. So these women were so far ahead of their time. And of course, we're still fighting many of the same battles that they fought.
One of my questions, and I don't know if anyone in the audience has questions, but if you do, we'll try to get to them too. But Charles Sumner is such an interesting character, and he plays such an interesting role through all of this.
Yes, I felt so lucky to have the character of Charles Sumner. I had taken a course with the great historian David Herbert Donald. I was so lucky. It was a course on Lincoln and the Civil War. And he wrote, of course, one of the great classic books about Lincoln, but he also wrote 2 books about Charles Sumner. And Sumner was this huge character, complete radical. And what I discovered as I started my research, Francis had only one friend in Washington, and that was Charles Sumner. And he was a bachelor. So he didn't have anyone cooking for him when he went home. So he would go and often from Congress, stop by his rented rooms. Before he did that, he stopped by the Seward House, and they would invite him to dinner, or he would just go and talk to Frances. And he liked Frances much better than he liked Seward, because she was just as radical as he was. So, and he, of course, was from Massachusetts, which was, and he hung around all of those abolitionists in Boston. And so the 2 of them just were, as close as they could be. And so I found all of their letters too at Harvard, and they were revelatory. Many of them had never been looked at before. So again, that helped develop my picture of Francis. And Charles Sumner turned out to lead. He was very jealous of Seward. He thought he would make a much better Secretary of State than Seward would. And so he led a group trying to get Lincoln to fire Seward. And of course, Lincoln refused to listen to them. But when Frances learned that her dear friend Charles had turned against her husband, she just wrote him out of her life for 2 years. She didn't speak to him.
And speaking of Lincoln and the presidency, could you talk from there, tell us a little bit from the point of view of these 3 women, the Emancipation Proclamation?
Yeah, well, so the most interesting to me perhaps was so Lincoln was elected in 1860, and between the time, there was a long hiatus between the time he was elected and the time he actually went to Washington. And by then, the women's rights organizers, of whom Martha was a very central, was Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Martha Coffin Wright, and by then Susan B. Anthony. They were the 3 leaders of the women's rights movement, especially in New York State. So they decided, to Susan B. Anthony's great regret, that they would cease their annual women's rights meetings and just devote themselves to having big meetings against Lincoln and against the incoming administration, because he wasn't radical enough. They distrusted the Republicans as much as they mistrusted the Democrats. And so they held these huge meetings, and they were saying these terrible things about the incoming administration, because Lincoln and Seward, of course, they wanted to keep the Union together. 7 states had already seceded. It was obviously, they knew that it would be a war if more states seceded. So they were desperately trying to keep it together. These women, these radical women, they just thought, let it go. Emancipation is much more important. And so this put Frances in a very awkward position, because politically she believed what her friends believed, but she was also very dedicated to her husband, as much as she disagreed with him. So there were all of these tensions, these marital tensions, and these incredibly important, strong female relationships, their political beliefs, their husband's political beliefs. And I just found the private public, the grassroots organizing versus what was going on in Congress. I just found it all really interesting, and a way to kind of understand how social movements form and then actually succeed in what they're trying to do in the long run.
Yes, it is incredible, but it must have been painful. I can't even think
Oh,
how painful it had to have been for Frances, her dear friends on the other side. But then we get into Lincoln being president and the impossibility of keeping the Union together. And
yes, and that, yes, sorry.
Go ahead.
So then that's where, so emancipated, Lincoln moved a little bit more. He and Seward became very, very, very close, to the extent that the rest of the cabinet became completely jealous and furious. And they thought politically very much the same. So they had, Lincoln had come around to being anti-slavery, but as was Seward and had been throughout his career. But Lincoln could not figure a way out to constitutionally emancipate the slaves, because it was built in, that was a states' right built into the Constitution. And finally, a couple of years into the war, he figured out how to do it by describing it as a military necessity. So he announced this to his cabinet, and initially Seward was opposed to this. He did not think that the country was ready for that. So again, just an interesting political dynamic. And once Lincoln had decided on emancipation, he was all in. And then he decided that freed Black men should be allowed to fight for the Union, which was, again, an extremely controversial issue. And a lot of white military men did not want to fight side by side with Black men. They didn't believe they could be trusted. They didn't believe they would make good soldiers. And of course, they were totally disproved on that point. It was, and this was, again, Harriet Tubman, during the course of the war, was down in South Carolina, where two of the first Black regiments were formed. And she saw these men and how courageous they were. And it was what she had been saying all along.
She also freed hundreds of slaves at that point who became very loyal.
Yes. On that incredible Combahee River raid, which she was invited to join on because she was already down there as a spy for the Union Army, and she had a little group of scouts who were feeding intelligence to her. She'd give it to the generals, and then they devised these series of raids along the rivers because the plantations were still inhabited by South Carolinians, and they torched, basically 4 plantations. And Harriet Tubman was on the lead gunboat, and she described this very vividly to her first biographer about how the steamer whistle would blow, and it was a signal to all of the enslaved people to run down to the river and get onto the boats because the Yankees had come to set them free. So the word had gotten out, and it worked unbelievably well. So she's helping these people on board. So, and she says at the end, she writes to one of her abolitionist friends in Boston, who happens to be a journalist and writes all about it, that they had freed 750 people on that mission.
On one mission. So Harriet was a spy in the war. She was a nurse. She was a liberator. How does any one human being get all that done?
I know. And again, this was 3 years, and this woman, she would decide what she had to do. She believed that this was God willing her to do it. And then she went and did it. So she had told Martha before she went down to South Carolina, she said, I'm on a secret mission, essentially. And Martha didn't know exactly what that meant. And Harriet, hadn't been given permission yet to do that. She finds a way through her friends in Boston to meet with the abolitionist governor of Massachusetts, who gives her permission to go to South Carolina. She gets down there and she decides, okay, because she had convinced this guy, he didn't need any convincing. She had spent 10 years as a guerrilla operative in Maryland. So she knew better than most soldiers did how to penetrate enemy territory. So she clearly convinces all of these generals, these mostly abolitionist generals in South Carolina, that she can be very useful to them. And they immediately agreed and put her to work. So, here's this woman, and she effectively becomes, she joins the army.
It's just beyond belief. And then she becomes a nurse at
Yes.
the same time.
Yes, and she used all these sort of homeopathic remedies and so on. And there too, she knew how to cure dysentery when dysentery was affecting everyone in the camp. And she says that she cured with this somehow natural concoction, that she cured it because they had some appalling, way of medical way of attempting to cure dysentery, which clearly was much more harmful to these poor victims than not. And whatever Harriet came up with seemed to work.
And for Martha and Francis, they had sons, and they were in the war.
Well, not only did they have sons, they all three of these women saw the war as a holy cause. That's what they called it. And Martha, remember, she was a Quaker, and Quakers are pacifists. She threw aside her pacifism, and she decided this was a war that had to be fought. And her son, she said it was the proudest moment of her life when her son Willie went to war. Of course, she was worried sick the entire time, and he almost got killed at Gettysburg. Frances too, she desperately didn't want her son to go. She was terrified. It was so much more likely that they wouldn't survive. Remember, the North was losing the war badly. These soldiers were just being killed by the tens of thousands. And so her son went down too. He fought in the Battle of Monocacy in Maryland. He too was wounded. What these families went through and these were young boys, 20, 21 years old. Martha had already lost her other two sons, one as a baby, and her eldest son died. He was drowned. So she was sending her only surviving son into war.
The bravery of these women and their families is truly something to think about as I think about where we are today with Ukraine and families. And it just, the book feels like it's just happening now.
I know. It's interesting you say that, because I've actually come to think that it feels to me as though it's almost as much about what is taking place in the 21st century as what took place in the 19th century. And again, it's a little bit trite for me to say that, because everyone says history repeats itself. But I think this is also what we all need, why we need to know what has happened in the past and what can be accomplished. These were three human beings who had absolutely no chance of succeeding at anything. They had no power, especially Harriet Tubman. And yet look at what they accomplished, and look at what the Ukrainians are accomplishing against a superpower. You just can't believe it.
And a lot of the pontificating that we hear sometimes among politicians feels very familiar to what we were hearing in the Senate and the Congress.
Yeah, and these women, this is the other thing, they just saw right through all of that. And that's what and again, this is what you missed, what we all missed when we were growing up, is the puncturing of these egos. Men wouldn't do that, and men writing about history, we couldn't see it from the women's perspective. Frances, and they were all living it. And Frances was there in Washington for part of the time, and she had to preside over these parties, and she had to listen to all of this, and she just thought it was such a bunch of hot air. And all of them did. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, one man once asked her, are you saying that women should have the right, not only should they have the right to vote, they should be elected to Congress? And she said, certainly they'd be a lot better at it than half the dolts who are currently in Congress.
Indeed. But before the war, before the South seceded, she had to entertain Jefferson Davis and his wife at dinner party. I can't even imagine how she managed to get through that dinner. I would have
Well, and she
It's a poison.
yes, and you've read the book, and she was very shy. She hated entertaining. She hated those hoop skirts and the whole rigmarole. She hated the contrast between, you know, these wealthy elites, of whom she of course was one, and then, you know, the slaves being led in chains down the mall to be sold at auction. It was completely abhorrent to her. And the first year that Seward went down to become senator, and Frances got a taste of this role she had to play, where she felt completely, you know, that she was working against her own most cherished beliefs. She wrote to her sister Lizette, "This is the life to which I am doomed." And it took her 9 years to figure out how she could really break out of that and not be her husband's hostess anymore, go back to Auburn and work with these women.
It, you couldn't say that the women's life was parallel to the slaves in any way, but there were so many things about being the property. Even if you were a well-to-do woman like Frances, your husband still had, you had to hope that everything would be all right.
And it often wasn't. I mean, it really wasn't. So Frances, early on in 1831, she had read Mary Wollstonecraft, who had written, you know, the British, Great British Mind, who had written a book about women and their how badly abused they were by men and how they needed to be educated. And she wrote that women were men's chattel. They were in effect their husband's slaves, and this resonated with women. Then suddenly in 1831, Frances is at her sister's house, and her sister is being beaten up by her husband, and he's abusing their daughter, and she couldn't do anything. Her brother-in-law threw her out of the house, so she had to write to Seward and say, you know, you've got to come home effectively and help. I can't do anything about this, and you know, Lizette is going to be, you know, seriously harmed. So this was when you live it, you know, then that was kind of the first catalyzing moment for Frances. And the second one was when she got her first view of slavery. So if you're already, you know, sort of living this life of repressed rage, knowing that, you know, you should have every right that the men around you had, and seeing that Black Americans had no rights at all, they believed they were only 2 generations removed from the Declaration of Independence. So they felt viscerally that this was wrong. And then they felt they had to do something about it, and they did.
And then as we go through the war and we're getting ready for the 13th Amendment, the women really stepped up, but they had hoped that it would not be limited to men, I think.
Yes, and that became really a source of trouble with the 14th and 15th Amendment. Mm-hmm. And that was when, and it's a very complicated story, but Susan B. Anthony, especially, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton believed so much in women's suffrage that when it became clear that Congress was going to give Black men the right to vote, but not women, white women, they decided that they were just going to, they would have nothing to do with that. And they allied themselves with a Trump-like figure who gave them all kinds of money, to complete, you know, white supremacists. They became racist, outright racist in their attempt to because they were monomaniacal about women getting the right to vote, and they devoted their lives to this mission. And Susan B. Anthony said at that point, it's going to take us 100 years to get to this point again. We have to get it now. We have to get it now. And of course they didn't. And they died well before the 19th Amendment was finally passed. But Martha was caught in the middle. She just completely disagreed with them, but she didn't have the courage to split with them, because she said to her husband, "I believe in standing by my friends even when they do unwise things." So that's pretty tough.
Pretty tough indeed. Uh, so I've somehow managed to forget the complications of the assassination. We all our hearts break over Lincoln's assassination, but there was so much more to it, uh, especially with the Francis. What happened to Francis?
Yes, it was, you know, it was a conspiracy. I mean, the three men were supposed to be killed that night, all sort of at this exactly the same time. So when Lincoln was being shot, a man entered the Seward's house late at night. It was 10 o'clock. Said he had a package for Seward, who had been injured in a carriage accident. He had a big brace on his neck. He pushed back the servant, pushed aside the servant, ran up the stairs. He had, you know, a pistol in one hand and a machete in the other, and proceeded to just create absolute mayhem. And it was this scene was, I'm not going to tell the whole story, but the scene was witnessed both by the Seward's young daughter, who was 20 years old and was sitting by her father's bed reading to him as he fell asleep, and Francis. And it was a bloodbath, and it was an absolute miracle that Seward survived. I mean, that man's really was very resilient. But it's one of the kind of culminating scenes in the book.
Yeah, and the third man fortunately got drunk, as I recall.
Yes,
Third assassin.
exactly.
So, although the women were all for temperance,
Yeah.
that was a fortunate thing. Could you talk a little bit about Harriet's life after the Civil War? I mean, when we were taught history, we learned a little bit about her role in the Civil War, not nearly as enough. But after that, I don't remember learning anything.
I don't think any of us did. So she, after the war, she worked for a little while in Washington in a hospital for Black soldiers because they were getting horrible treatment. And when her money completely ran out, because she ended up not being paid for the work she did throughout the war, she went back to Auburn, where she had bought this house from Francis Seward, stopped in first to see Lucretia Mott, Martha's older sister, and they had a nice chat. And we have records of all of that. Went on to Brooklyn, gave a speech in Brooklyn, and then finally went back to Auburn. And she spent the rest of her life in that house that she bought from Francis, and devoted the rest of her life to human rights. And she talked about women's suffrage. She talked about you know, equal rights for Black men and women. She's arranged Christmas fairs to raise money for the people, the freed people of South Carolina, whom of course she had been working with for all those years. And she devoted the last few decades of her life to establishing really a nursing home for impoverished African Americans. And again, this is a woman who had no money, had no resources, but she had many friends at that point. And she talked about leadership. This was one of the great leaders. And so she was able to add to her property in Auburn, get this facility built with the help of all of these donations and all these people who she got to work on her behalf, including Martha Coffin Wright, who joined her, did whatever Harriet asked her to do for these Christmas fairs, you know, and she got everybody in Auburn to help her. She was just, you know, the first citizen of Auburn. I mean, people adored her. She got to know everybody. And then she lived until 1913. So this was another thing that I discovered on that first trip to Auburn, when I started interviewing people about both people in my grandmother's, descendants of my grandmother and the descendants of her best friend who still lived in Auburn. And the story went around in that woman's family that my grandmother and her best friend, Rosamond Underwood, were standing on South Street, which is where the Seward House Museum is, and also where Harriet Tubman's house was. And they were 4 or 5 years old, and they saw Harriet Tubman pass by. And think of that. My grandmother's life overlapped with Harriet Tubman's. And that again, I couldn't quite fathom that. And that was one of the other things that I was trying to sort of uncover in the course of trying to figure out how did Harriet Tubman end up in Auburn and how did her path cross with my grandmother's.
And of course, your book about your grandmother is one of my favorites as well. What a wonderful saga. But one of the things I loved about Harriet was that, she's this warrior. She's this Underground Railroad major force. And yet when she was older, she talked to the children in Auburn. And I was thinking how wonderful it would have been to be able to sit in her house and listen to her.
Absolutely. And people did write down thankfully, what it was like to listen to Harriet Tubman speak. And she loved, and this is how I was able to put her life together, really. And, took some of the scholarship and then just a lot of the anecdotal stories that people had about meeting Harriet Tubman, listening to her speak. And so one man, when he grew up, wrote about the experience of sitting down on the floor with other children and listening to Harriet Tubman talk about her the rescue operation she ran in Troy, New York, during the height of the uproar over the Fugitive Slave Act. And that alone is just such an incredible story. And she was a wonderful storyteller and funny, and she acted out all the parts. And imagine what it was like to be a child and just be, wrapped and hear these stories of life before the Civil War, the years that led up to the Civil War, and this great American hero right there in front of you. Extraordinary.
It is extraordinary. And to think that you found it all and brought it to us. I mean, this is truly a gift for the future and to those of us who have the chance to read the book. And I know that many of the people watching have already bought the book as part of their ticket. And I just want to say, if you're thinking of just the right book to give anyone at any age, The Agitators is terrific. Give it to young feminists, give it to old feminists, give it to guys.
Yes.
There's some really interesting men in this book. And we've been talking about the women, but give it to the guys, especially if you're a feminist, because they'll love the adventure. They'll love finding out about what Frederick Douglass did, what Garrison did. But there were some really heroic men in this book.
And Lincoln and Seward, and they're all incredible characters. And each played his or her part in the best way he or she knew how.
And they did it. I mean, the fact that, frankly, Harriet and her two friends were able to get this to organize. I mean, Harriet was a phenomenon, but you need people with you on the Underground Railroad. And what a time in our country, as to think of the good people who did what needed to be done is gives us perhaps hope for the future here.
Well, it does, especially, and just a final note on that, that was the 1850s was just about as divided as this country has ever been. And we felt a little bit, now more than a little bit, we felt a lot about that in recent years. And I think people were really, and still are, just completely undone by the attack on the Capitol. And, the investigations are underway and so on. But it's very dangerous when white supremacy rises again. And it's absolutely crucial that people put a stop to that and remind us all what active good citizenship is. And it does require acting on your beliefs, not just assuming that everything's going to be fine and someone else will take care of it.
I think that is one of the beauties of the book, that these people stepped up and acted on their beliefs, and no matter what it took, they did it. Uh, these are true heroes, the three women, but also the people around them, truly stood for what was right and gave up a lot to do it. So, Dorothy, thank you so much for giving us The Agitators. It's a book for everyone's library. I have a hardback and a paperback because I lend the paperback to friends and I keep my hardback treasure on my shelf. But I can't wait to see what you're going to write next. I'm sure it's going to take a while after this, but when you do, please come back, because you have taught us all so much and made it fun too, because this book has so many parts that are fascinating. We could only touch on it, but weren't we lucky to have this hour together?
Oh, well, thank you so much, Elaine. I love your bookstore, and I urge people to support your independent bookstores. It's really important. And many thanks to Dominican University as well. It's a great pleasure.
And I thank the Bank of Marin and everyone at Dominican and extended session. I hope that you will join us on the 4th of April, when Elizabeth Alexander will be speaking about the Trayvon Martin generation. And it is a perfect follow-up to what we're talking about today. So join us then. And then please join us on the 18th of April, when we will be welcoming Valerie Biden, her the first sister, Joe Biden's sister, who from the time he ran his very first campaign in his early 20s has been his campaign manager all the way through the presidential. It should be a fascinating day and evening, and I hope you'll join us in person that day. And also when Luann Brenzdine and Tiffany Schlain come shortly after. So please keep reading and keep changing the world, all of us. And Dorothy, I cannot thank you enough.
Oh, thank you. It's a great pleasure.